Hi, I'm Miss Hottie from Olympian High School. We're going to use the Traditions and Encounters textbook by Dr. Bentley, starting on page 1149, to look at global diseases. Now, one of the things I want to remind you is that um, when history ends and when current events begin is open to debate. Most historians use a rule of thumb of about 30 years ago to say that's when we're going to, that's history, and anything after that is current events. So anything within the last 30 years is more current events. The reason I say that is because you're probably wondering if you could talk about coronavirus and COVID on the AP exam when we're talking about global diseases. And it may or may not count depending on who's grading and how flexible they're going to be. But some of this information that's in your book is outdated. You still need to know it. And it would be best that if you could talk to things that were more historical rather than more current events. But for your own general edification as a human being to understand about diseases and the history of diseases, of course, it's worth your time to study the spread of COVID and coronavirus and more common current diseases, and also to update yourself on some of the diseases that are mentioned in this section and some of the new um, treatments that are available, new vaccines that are available. So first of all, we know there's almost 8 billion people in the world, and that diseases have been a consistent, regular part of human history since the dawn of time. So this is not something new, and this is something that often hurts human population numbers. And of course, if we look back in history, and you could use something as simple as a Google search on the History Channel, you could look to many instances in history where there have been previous disease outbreaks, and you could look at the different various plagues in different time periods. Of course, the most famous being the Black Death of the 1300s, but also the Columbian Exchange. Think about the fact that in some history books, they say that it killed up to 90%. Not every historian agrees, but some historians say it may have killed up to 90% of human populations in the Americas in about 150 years. Or even if we look at what's called the Spanish flu or the flu of 1918, in your textbook, it says that killed about 20 million people. But these days, if you look at history books, they'll cite a much higher estimate of about 50 million people. If you compare that to the current disease that has broken out that we're all contending with, which is why you're learning online, COVID-19 or coronavirus, that's about almost 3 million deaths. And of course, there's debate about, are those numbers accurate? But in any case, I just want you to understand that global diseases have been a persistent feature of human history, and they'll continue to be a persistent part of human history in the future. So make sure you know that this, coronavirus isn't the first one. Go back and study about the Columbian Exchange, which I mentioned earlier. We talked about the Spanish flu or the flu of 1918. There have been a lot of organizations working towards the eradication of certain diseases, either by helping poorer communities with nutrition, which helps you fight better against disease, or by actually working on cures for diseases. So certain organizations have helped to eradicate smallpox and diphtheria. The United Nations called for an end of all infectious diseases by 2000. That didn't happen, but there have been significant gains in trying to fight global diseases, although some diseases have made a comeback, like malaria, tuberculosis, and of course now there are fears about other diseases that sometimes ravage through societies. Like for a while, we were all very scared that Ebola virus was going to get out of hand and spread all over the world before coronavirus hit us. Or there are diseases like MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which with certain mutations could also significantly impact our populations. And there's also HIV AIDS. So let's talk about HIV AIDS. Your book references it as the most serious epidemic threat, but of course, COVID-19 right now is the most serious epidemic threat. But AIDS is a disease that's caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. Ultimately, it attacks your immune system, which makes it so that you're incapable of fighting off disease, which causes you to die from a disease that you normally would recover from. It's spread through many ways. One way is through sexual contact with an infected person, contaminated blood. So if you get a blood transfusion in the past, people got AIDS that way. It can be transferred from mother to child during pregnancy and through breastfeeding. Um, there are many things that contribute to the spread of AIDS. The first documented case of AIDS happened in 1981 amongst homosexual men and intravenous drug users in New York and San Francisco. So there was a huge misunderstanding for a long time that this disease was just a disease that affected the homosexual community, and that's not true, or that affected drug users. That's not true. That said, so this is a graphic that represents, for every one of these like little people drawings, it's 100,000 people. It represents the spread of HIV/AIDS throughout the world. And as you can see, it's dramatically impacted sub-Saharan Africa, but another place that it's really affected the world is in India or South Asia, South and Southeast Asia. And that has a significant impact on society. I will say that something that's not in your book that I learned about recently that I wasn't aware of until a friend from New York told me about it. There are new diseases that help to treat AIDS. So many people living in New York, especially in the homosexual community and other communities that want to avoid getting HIV, have access to a drug called PrEP, which stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. And I don't know very much about it, but I do know that in addition to the use of condoms, many people take this pill as a way of preventing the transmission of HIV/AIDS. The brand name for this drug is Truvada. So if you were like me and not aware of this, now you're aware of it, and it's not in your book. So I thought I would share that with you. This is one of those new treatments that are available. But some of the other treatments that are available are not always accessible to people that are poor or poverty stricken. So people that have access to money often have access to being able to continue living their lives even with AIDS, but not everyone has those resources. This section goes into the impact of AIDS in Africa. It tells you that, in the whole world at that time, the book was published, about 38.6 million people had HIV/AIDS. Most of them were living in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is also going to affect children, not only because children sometimes can contract the disease, but also because when their parents died, they're often left as orphans, taken care of by much older grandparents that don't have the energy and resources, or taken care of by no one, right? So when I say, orphan from their parents, but sometimes they still have caregivers, sometimes they don't. And of course, you need a nurturing, stable home to grow into a successful adult. I mean, it's not some people can do without that, but it makes your circumstances and your quality of life much harder. Tears at the economic and social fabric of a society. It tells you about how difficult it is for people to care with family members that become sick with AIDS, and the sudden loss of financial support from people in the prime of their life, because this is affecting people who are sexually active in the prime of their life that are dying. It's not the very old and the very young. Like many diseases, AIDS can affect people that are adults that are important to the economy. There are some positive successes towards trying to prevent AIDS or educate people about the spread of AIDS in Africa. But there, on the other hand, you also see HIV/AIDS infection rates increasing in Asia. And then it goes into talking to you about some of the new technologies meant to fight against AIDS, but they're not always effective in that not everyone has access to them. They cost money. And then there are also other treatments that can be, without the need of male participation. So things that women can do to try to create an inhospitable environment for the AIDS virus. And unfortunately, there is no vaccine yet, but I've heard a lot of stories. I'm not up to date with the most current HIV/AIDS research, but that's something you can study on your own. And of course, there have been other diseases that are not mentioned in your book, like the swine flu that took place, or the bird flu. So this has been something that historians and people that study the history of disease have been anticipating. So the outbreak of COVID-19 was not a surprise to many people that study history and understand that this is something that happens frequently and recurring. It's a recurring thing that happens throughout history. And we don't know what future mutations and diseases may affect human populations. Luckily, we have science, so there's that to keep us optimistic. We have technology, we have information that we can share. Now we have a vaccine for COVID-19, as you know, but there may be other diseases in the future that spread that also lead to millions of deaths. This is part of the human historical trajectory and experience.